You're listening to
DNA ID.
brought to you by AbJack Entertainment. Be sure to check out some of the other great true crime podcasts from this network, including The Murder in My Family, Missing Persons, Scene of the Crime,
Zodiac Speaking,
Beyond Bizarre True Crime,
Citizen Detective, and
Campus Killings.
all of these podcasts are available for you to binge on right now, wherever you listen to podcasts. Subscribe where you're listening to this podcast so you don't miss an episode.
It was 1975. On Friday, December 5th, Celeste and Merle Little attended their son's high school basketball game, and when it was over, decided to stop in and visit their young niece. Lindy was just 19, and she lived with her husband of just over a year, Philip, in their apartment on Kloss Drive off Millersville Road in Manor Township, Lancaster, Pennsylvania. The Littles were close with their niece, and they knew she would be home alone, as her husband worked on Friday evenings. Celeste had promised to drop off a recipe, so they drove to the Spring Manor apartment complex. Merle, who was handicapped, waited in the car while Celeste opened the unlocked entryway door to the two-story building and entered the shadowy interior hallway. She approached the door of apartment 104A. It was 8:42 p.m. Unsettlingly, the door to the apartment stood partially ajar. Celeste knocked gently, but Lindy didn't answer. After calling her name a few times, Celeste pushed the door the rest of the way open. She saw Lindy right away in the small room. Lindy lay face up on the living room floor near the breakfast nook. Her legs were bent underneath her at a very unnatural angle, her head pointing toward the front door. She had a tea towel-covered knife handle sticking out of the left side of her neck. Her eyes were open. Blood was everywhere. I don't know if Celeste screamed, ran out of the building to get Merle, or what, but she pulled herself together enough to call the police. West End EMT and Fire Chief of Wheatland Fire Company Patrick Egan received the call from dispatch that a woman had been stabbed. As he pulled into the Spring Manor apartment complex, he saw a man and a woman waving frantically at him. It was Celeste and Merle, who had anxiously been awaiting his arrival. They told him their niece had appeared to be dead on her living room floor. Egan went into apartment 104A and saw immediately that there was no helping Lindy. The knife sticking out of the side of her neck was a large butcher knife, and the wound to her throat was not the only one she'd suffered. She had been stabbed to death, and it was a bloodbath. Egan located the house phone in the apartment and used it to dial the Manor Township PD for officer backup. Then he went outside and conveyed the bad news to the Littles. Their 20-year-old niece Lindy was deceased. Sergeant James Reaver pulled up to the apartment complex at 8:51 p.m. Patrick Egan briefed Reaver on what he would find inside, and the sergeant went to see for himself. Blood was spattered all over the entranceway west wall just inside the front door. Blood was splashed on the outside of the front door and the inside of the front door. Bloodstains marked the living room rug as well. Blood was on the floor all around Lindy's body. Sergeant Reaver stood and took in the scene. It was immediately apparent that a physical confrontation had gone down right there in the living room. A lamp had been knocked off an end table and was broken on the floor. As for Lindy herself, she was clothed, but her shirt and jeans were soaked in blood, and her shirt, partially pushed up, had numerous stab wounds in it. Her bell-bottom jeans were unbuttoned and unzipped all the way, partially exposing the pantyhose over underwear she wore underneath. The butcher knife was left sticking out of the left side of her throat, but the green and white tea towel wrapped around it exposed part of a wooden handle that was a clear match to a set of knives in the knife rack mounted on the kitchen wall. An empty space in the rack implied where the butcher knife had come from. Examination of the crime scene would later reveal matching tea towels to the one wrapped around the knife hilt, indicating that whoever killed Lindy had used whatever he or she could find in the apartment and had taken precautions not to leave fingerprints and or not to have their hand slip on the slippery, bloody knife handle. It was a move that implied deliberation, a measured decision to stab or continue to stab. At 8:59 p.m., Sergeant Reaver ordered the living room sealed off. Within minutes, Lieutenant Harvey West arrived and ordered everyone but crime scene personnel out of the apartment. At approximately 9:15 p.m., Deputy Coroner Dr. Clyde Musselman pronounced Lindy deceased. Meanwhile, the Littles, Merle and Celeste, were interviewed in the bedroom of Lindy's apartment. Merle suffered from MS and couldn't stand for lengths of time. In the bedroom, he could rest comfortably while speaking with the police. Thank goodness someone thought to call Philip, Lindy's husband. He got a phone call at work at 8:50 p.m. from Thelma Little, Lindy's stepmother. She told him he needed to go home. Something had happened to Lindy. Philip later said that as he sped home in his car, his mind raced, thinking, car accident, a fall, something like that. He told the Intelligencer Journal, quote, "When I got home, they wouldn't let me in the apartment. They kept me in the hallway. Finally, the coroner, I think it was, came out and told me. They gave me a tranquilizer, and the only thing I remember that night is sleeping at my mother's house. I just wandered around in a daze for 3 or 4 days," end quote. Lindy's autopsy was performed at Conestoga View Medical Center on the morning of December 6th around 9 a.m. by forensic pathologist Dr. Enrique Penades. Lindy was measured at 65 inches tall, 130 pounds. Removal of the knife plunged into her neck showed it had an 8-inch blade, your classic butcher knife, from a set that was no doubt a wedding gift for the recent bride. Dr. Penades determined that the cause of death was hemorrhage, due to multiple stab wounds to the body, and the manner of death was homicide. Specifically, Lindy had 19 total stab wounds, 3 stab wounds to the neck, 11 to the chest and upper abdomen, and 5 to the back, and a 4-inch wide wound to the left side of her throat made by the embedded knife. The doctor noted that the stab wounds appeared to have been made by 2 different knives. One was obviously the butcher knife. The other was a thin-bladed 4-inch blade that was not found at the scene and that had been used first. The stabs resulted in lacerations to Lindy's right carotid artery and her pulmonary artery and pierced the left ventricle of her heart and her left lung. Several of the stab wounds were inflicted after Lindy was already dead. She did have defensive wounds in the form of cuts to her hands, though, that indicated she fought through at least some of the attack. Lindy's clothing, jeans, pantyhose, underwear, bra, and knit shirt was collected and given to the Manor Township Police Department and secured into evidence. Later in December, it was transferred to the Pennsylvania State Police Crime Lab, which reported in February that there was human blood on the clothing. Based on the autopsy report and the police reports, Deputy Coroner Dr. Clyde Musselman estimated Lindy's time of death at between 6 and 7 p.m. Let's talk about who Lindy was. Lindy Sue Little was born in Lancaster, Pennsylvania on January 31st, 1956, to parents Wayne and Eleanor Little. She was a beautiful child and then young woman, with wavy reddish blonde hair, a shy smile, and gorgeous cheekbones. She was funny but reticent among strangers, and lacking in the confidence she needed to persist in interests she pursued and then abandoned, like baton twirling and the Girl Scouts. She was very close with her parents, her older half-sister Eileen Martin, and a small group of friends. Wayne and Eleanor divorced when Lindy was just 4, and her mom remarried Harry Tammany and then married again to Gary Giese. Lindy lived with them on Ann Street. She spent weekends and holidays with her father Wayne, but moved permanently to the house of her father and his wife Thelma when she was in her teens. Lindy attended Edward Hand Junior High and then went to McClaskey High School. She was not a scholar and was disinterested in schooling, but was given direction by her father, who was an industrial specialist for the Department of Defense, and insisted that she finish high school. So she obtained business training to be a secretary at Conestoga Valley High School, studying shorthand, typing, bookkeeping, business writing, and so on. She was also in the ceramics club, learning several artistic skills with the encouragement of her stepmother, Thelma. After graduating, Lindy Sue had a series of jobs, trying to figure out her passion, what excited her, what moved her. When she died at age 19, She'd been working for 6 months for florist Bob Almond at his small flower shop off Cottage Avenue. Almond had hired her to run the business for him, perform secretarial services, and so on. But the two quickly discovered that Lindy would be indispensable. She became involved in every aspect of the floral shop's business, from doing the books, to flower arranging and caring for the plants, to organizing and curating the presentation of the shop's offerings. Customers loved her, and she loved the job and told everyone she was close with so. The day before she was killed, she brought home-baked blueberry muffins into her boss, Bob Almond, for his 34th birthday. Of course, Lindy had also recently married. She had met her future husband through her half-sister Eileen and Eileen's husband Gary, who had Lindy over to help them paint their apartment. They also invited Philip Biechler, who lived in the apartment below them. Philip was 5 years older than Lindy, but it was love at first sight, he told the Lancaster New Era. People in both families felt the two were perfect for each other. Philip described Lindy at L&P Lancaster as, quote, extremely compassionate and unbelievably charming. He later told the Intelligencer Journal, quote, I learned a lot from Lindy. She made me feel a little more confident about myself. I think we helped each other. She just needed somebody to really care for her, and so did I. She was a lot like me. We were both very introverted, end quote. Philip's grandfather, a reverend, assisted in marrying the two on October 19, 1974, and Lindy and Philip moved into a one-bedroom apartment in Spring Manor Apartments. Philip was working at Hertz to pay his college tuition. The son of an art gallery owner, he was enrolled in art classes at Millersville State and was an aspiring painter and sculptor. Lindy was content working in the flower shop, being a new wife and looking forward to motherhood. She was someone who always wanted several children. To be a young mother, she gravitated towards kids. In the meantime, she filled their apartment with plants, which she loved. Everything was pointing toward Lindy and Philip enjoying a long and happy marriage and creating a loving family together. But that was not to be. After the murder, Philip told the media his dreams, so recently attained, were shattered. Okay, back to the murder scene. Manor Township Police Sergeant James Reaver and Lieutenant Harvey West were in charge. 2 Pennsylvania State Troopers were also assigned to the case, Sorrel Ulrich and Robert Swartwood. The apartment complex consisted of a number of identical 2-story brick buildings situated on Claus Drive in Manor Township, about a mile north of Millersville. The apartment was tiny. I'd describe it as a studio with a tiny separate bedroom on one end. The kitchen wasn't a separate room, but was just separated from the living room by a counter. From the front door, you could see everything in the apartment save the interiors of the small bedroom and bathroom. As I said in the intro, blood was noted on the outside of the front door and on the exterior hallway floor. Celeste Little hadn't noticed it in the darkened hallway. Blood was also on the inside of the door. This blood was not a smear or transfer stain. It was arterial spray. It told the investigators that Lindy had been attacked at the doorway when the apartment door was open. Several patches of blood on the living room rug showed that Lindy had moved around as she was being stabbed, presumably trying to get away. A lamp in the living room had been knocked off the end table and broken. And based on blood found on Lindy's exposed pantyhose, police believed from very early on that the killer had cut himself during the attack. State police fingerprinted the scene. No prints were found on the knife handle, probably because of the towel wrapped around it. One important print noted was actually a shoe print. The killer left behind a size 10 or greater footprint in blood in the kitchen. Someone with feet larger than Lindy's had stepped in the blood. The police ended up having to check 12 people who they knew were at the scene and compare their shoe prints to eliminate all of them as being the source of the print. To this day, it is not known for certain whether this print was left behind by the killer. But much more oddly, there were no signs of forced entry to the apartment. Phil Biechler was vehement that Lindy would absolutely have locked the apartment door, and it required a key to open it from the outside whenever it was closed. And several bags of groceries were on the dining room table. It was clear that Lindy had been interrupted while she was doing domestic tasks. Police set about reconstructing the timeline of her day to try to figure out what the heck had happened here. Lindy went to work that Friday, December 5th, as usual. She worked at Bob Almond's Landis Flower and Gift Shop at 28 Cottage Avenue. She went to work at 7:30 a.m., wearing what she was later found dead in, jeans and a top. She worked a long day, preparing poinsettia plants and weaving wreaths for the upcoming Christmas holiday festivities. Lindy was excited for Christmas and had already made a ceramic paint palette for her husband, Philip. She and her friend and co-worker, the store's floral designer, Diane Hershey, closed up the floral shop and left at the same time, 5:15 p.m. They waved bye to each other from their respective cars. From there, Lindy went to Philip's workplace, Hertz Rent-A-Car, in the 200 block of North Queen Street, to pick up his weekly paycheck, so she could deposit both their earnings before the bank closed. Lindy was very familiar with the Hertz branch, as her stepsister Eileen and her husband Gary also worked there. Sometime around 5:50, she drove to Commonwealth National Bank and went inside, giving the endorsed checks to the teller for depositing in the young couple's account. Then she went to the grocery store. Lindy did her shopping at John Herr's Village Market. She was seen in the store, which was her regular grocery store, between 6 and 6:30 p.m. by meat department employees. She purchased 4 bags worth of groceries, spending $46 at checkout aisle number 4. She then drove home with her bags. Police learned from a neighbor across the street at 105B Kloss Drive, Sally Strebel, that Lindy's turquoise 1968 Impala was not in her parking spot at 6:45 p.m., but was parked rear end in its spot when Sally looked out the window, again at 7:05. The police found the car locked, the keys in Lindy's purse, which was found undisturbed in a spot in her bedroom where it was believed she put it herself. Police concluded that she returned home between 6:45 and 7:05 p.m. The police believe that Lindy encountered her attacker very soon after or immediately upon returning home. The groceries sitting on the table told them that. Lindy had started to put them away, but had not yet finished. One of the still full bags had meat in it. You don't just leave that sitting out to rot. Had someone come home with her? Did someone come to the door? Or was someone watching her? Merle and Celeste arrived at 8:42. There was less than a 2-hour window in which Lindy had been slain in her apartment. Investigators' interviews with Lindy's friends and family uncovered some crucial information. The only problem Lindy was known to have in her new married life was that she was scared to be alone at night while Philip was at work. Lindy's high school friend, Jean Scott, told the police that Lindy was so worried about it, she would sometimes get a rash. Lindy was not used to living on her own, and she was naturally a more timid person, skittish by nature, what one acquaintance described as scared of a mouse. But Lindy's fears were not just typical, vague, scared of the dark type concerns. Her family told the investigators that Lindy felt that someone was watching her. According to the Lancaster New Era, Lindy's close friend and neighbor Betty Jean Parkhill said, quote, "Lindy felt someone was watching her and following her. Lindy always felt uncomfortable. I remember the last few weeks before she was killed, something was going on. I can't say she shared everything with me, but I knew she wasn't feeling right about the whole situation." Betty Jean told the publication that Lindy had seen someone lurking outside the sliding glass doors to her apartment. These glass doors were located in the living room and looked out to the woods behind the building. Lindy reportedly felt the presence of an unknown person lurking behind her apartment more than once, and it spooked her. Lindy's stepsister, Eileen Martin, told the Lancaster New Era that sometime in the 6 months before Lindy's death, quote, she thought somebody was looking through the sliding glass doors. There were trees back there behind her apartment. At night, she thought someone was watching her, end quote. It's pretty clear Lindy was freaked out by something. Her younger brother, Mike Little, told me about an incident in which Philip and Lindy were over babysitting the much younger boy, and a crash came from upstairs in the large house. Lindy was totally freaked out and made Philip go through the entire house, even though it quickly became apparent that a mirror had fallen over. In another incident, Lindy was at the house alone, and she called her stepsister Eileen, saying she thought she heard someone in the house. So, Lindy was in a near-constant state of alertness and agitation. But she knew her fears were short-lived. Lindy and Philip were moving to a new apartment complex in January 1976. Lindy wanted to get a Norwegian elk hound, and their current apartment didn't allow for animals. She just had to get through New Year's and they would be on their way. Lindy's mother told the Intelligencer Journal that she had seen Lindy just the night before her slaying, and she was totally normal. Eleanor described her daughter as a very tender and thoughtful person. She was, quote, very happy the past year, very happy with her marriage. I've been racking my brain. I can't think of any person who would have had that kind of resentment toward her. I just pray that they find out who did this. On November 7th, 2 days after the murder, the Manor Township Police issued a plea for information. A police spokesman told the press, quote, we will accept anything, even an anonymous call. On the day of Lindy's funeral, Monday, December 8th, Manor Township Police Chief Donald Sheeler acknowledged to the media, quote, we actually don't have a thing at this time. This despite 8 full-time investigators working the case. Sheeler also pointed out that the police suspected the person leaving the scene would have been literally covered in blood. Once the funeral was over, police sat down for more thorough conversations with Lindy's family, hoping some little nugget of information would provide a viable lead. One of the first people they wanted to talk to was Philip Biechler. Police focused pretty heavily on Philip in those first few days and weeks. Philip later said that it was clear to him that the investigators were focused on him and stayed there for quite some time. The lack of forced entry to the apartment, the lack of any witnesses seeing or hearing anything, and the use of a knife and towel found from within the apartment were all pointing to an inside job. But Hertz confirmed 24-year-old Philip's alibi right away. He had been at the rental car office for the entire evening. People saw him there during the window in which the murder was known to take place. Despite the advice of his attorney to the contrary, Philip took a polygraph and gave blood and hair samples. He later said he felt strongly that had the police turned their attention elsewhere more expeditiously, they might have had more luck finding Lindy's real killer. Besides Philip, the police questioned family, friends, employers, classmates, quote, everyone who knew her. This included members of her extended family, Philip's brother Jack, whom Lindy was close with, Philip's friends, Lindy's school friends, flower shop customers and delivery personnel, and so on. By 6 days after the murder, police had already talked to close to 100 people. We are running checks of everybody who knew her and everybody in the apartment complex, said Lieutenant Harvey West of the Manor Township Police on December 7th. The investigators uncovered various drama in Lindy's family, including reportedly an extramarital affair Philip's mother was engaged in that Lindy knew about. The man having the affair with Philip's mom, George M., had made inappropriate sexual remarks about Lindy to Philip, and he knew where the young couple lived. Perhaps Lindy had threatened to reveal the affair, or perhaps George had come on to Lindy. All of this had to be investigated, but George M. was a respected attorney in town, and it seems police gave up on him as a suspect. Part of the reason the investigation was stymied was that there was no apparent motive in the slaying. Philip couldn't identify anything missing from the apartment. Lindy's purse was undisturbed, her jewelry on her person. Lieutenant West said, quote, she was killed. For what reason? We don't know. Despite that minor extended family drama, everyone loved Lindy and Phil. Their neighbors said they were great and never argued. They were lovely, polite, respectable people. They had no enemies. They didn't do drugs. There were no rumors of any funny business or unsavory habits or behavior. Lindy worked in a flower shop, for God's sake. They were young newlyweds, deeply in love and happy in their quiet life together. Of course, police canvassed the neighborhood. Neighbors interviewed by the local newspapers said they hadn't seen any prowlers or anything unusual. It was, in general, a very safe neighborhood. The affordable yet pleasant complex was full of busy young professionals and starting-out couples. There were, on occasion, the usual burglaries and such, but nothing like a horrific stabbing murder. One of Lindy's upstairs neighbors in the 4-unit building spoke with Lancaster Online. This was Gloria Charuca. Gloria had moved into one of the upstairs units in August 1975, and she knew Lindy just from passing in the common hallway area. She said that on the evening of December 5th, she came home from an overtime shift at Lancaster newspapers and walked into the apartment building's common hallway. This was before the police arrived, as Lindy's aunt and uncle were freaking out, and Celeste was running all over the apartment in a panic, destroying the crime scene. The apartment door was wide open, and Gloria saw the whole bloody scene. From Lancaster Online, quote, it was the body of Lindy Sue Biechler, which lay on the floor just inside Biechler's first-floor unit. She was laying inside the door and her pants were unzippered, but they weren't down. And there was a little table inside the door and there was glass, I think it was an oil lamp, that might have been knocked over, said Cheroka. And the aunt and uncle were in her bedroom because the aunt was putting her husband on the bed because I think he had multiple sclerosis. And I remember seeing the groceries weren't put away. And they had a bird, too, because I remember I said to the policeman, "It's too bad the bird can't talk, you know? You could find out more." Too bad, indeed. Lieutenant Harvey West of the Manor Township Police was frustrated in his hopes that someone in the building had seen or heard anything. It was evident that Lindy and her attacker had tussled in the apartment. Based on the toppled lamp, she might even have been running away from him. Maybe she'd screamed and someone looked out the window and saw the assailant leaving. But as reported by the Lancaster New Era, quote, "The occupants of the apartment across from the Biechlers and the persons living in the 2 upstairs apartments all were away when the woman was killed," said Lieutenant West, leaving no one in the building, end quote. There were only 4 apartments in the building, 2 upstairs and 2 downstairs. Lindy's apartment was one of the 2 on the ground floor. It was just bad luck that no one else was in the building. Or someone knew that and picked that very moment to strike. Several people who lived nearby reported to the police seeing an unfamiliar dark-colored American-made car parked on Kloss Drive outside the apartment complex on the evening of the murder, between 7 and 8 p.m. They noticed it because it was parked on the roadway, perpendicular to several cars that were parked nose-in their parking spots, and the high-beam lights were on. One witness saw the interior dome light on as well. Could someone have followed Lindy home from the grocery store, double-parked, and run in and stabbed her? Police issued a public plea for information about the driver of the vehicle. This car was never identified. They expanded the canvas into a, quote, block-by-block check of the apartment complex, but it's not clear they did that thorough of a job. One neighbor across the street in Building 102, Carol Hargan, later reported to Lindy's family that just before the murder, she and her husband had witnessed the explosive anger of an upstairs neighbor who was a Navy SEAL and had become enraged at noise emanating from their apartment. Carol said she was never interviewed by police, so this lead went unreported for years. Because the authorities in Pennsylvania will not release their investigative files, we have no way of knowing whether the investigation was thorough and exhaustive. Did they look into all neighbors and former neighbors? They did look at men one detective described as local creeps, but did they interview all sex offenders in the area? Did they look at people recently released from prison, or suicides that occurred shortly after the murder? Did they look into delivery people or maintenance or utility workers in the area? We just don't know. We do know that the crime scene informed the investigators' theories about what happened. Lindy's car was backed into its parking spot, literally right outside the exterior door to the 4-unit building. This door, which accessed the hallway to the 2 ground floor units and the stairs to the 2 upper units, was not kept locked. Anyone could walk into the building. Theories that Lindy interrupted a burglary in progress were considered and ruled out. First of all, there was no evidence of tampering or forced entry. Lindy was fastidious about locking the doors, so it was unlikely a burglar had entered. The sliding glass doors were secured, and nothing had been stolen. Lindy's jewelry was all accounted for and her purse was untouched. No, it seemed Lindy herself was the target. The detectives measured out 9 paces from Lindy's car to the exterior door and started to hypothesize about what could have happened. Presumably, the 4 bags of groceries were in the car's trunk, since she backed the car in, so the trunk was closest to the door. So she likely parked, locked the car with the manual key, opened the trunk using the key, took 2 bags of groceries out with her purse over her arm, and went into the building, shouldering the exterior door open. She probably had to put down one or both bags to unlock the apartment door with the keys, and open the apartment door. Once inside, she deposited the 2 bags on the table and came back out and got the other 2, closed the trunk, and went back inside. The bags were on the table, so we know she made it inside and put her stuff down, putting her purse in the bedroom. Police were told that she always locked the door when she was home, but maybe she left it open as she made the second trip back to the car to retrieve the other 2 bags, and this was her killer's first opportunity to slip inside the apartment. It was possible. Lieutenant Harvey West told the Lancaster Sunday News, quote, "Maybe he followed her in or went in when she went back to the car to get a second load." The attacker could have been hiding in the shadows of the dark interior hallway or just up the stairs just outside her door, which led to the second-floor units, waiting to make his move. When she went out to get the second load of groceries, he slipped inside. Or, in the alternative, he could have seen Lindy come home and then offered to help her carry the groceries, or just knocked on the door as she was putting them away. Either way, it meant that someone was watching her. Around 7 p.m. on December 5th in Pennsylvania, it's dark outside. Lindy wouldn't have seen someone lurking in the shadows as she carried the groceries inside. He could have been hiding outside the building, waiting for her to come home. Or he could have been peering in the windows or glass doors, waiting to see a light come on, or even see Lindy moving about in the apartment. As you heard from Lieutenant West a moment ago, police believed firmly that Lindy's attacker was a man. The bloody shoe print was far too large for a woman, and the attack didn't result in a sustained struggle, as it likely would have with a woman, the police guessed. And as an alternative to the theories that a man slipped into the apartment behind Lindy, or as she stepped out for more bags, some of the investigators strongly endorsed the theory that Lindy knew her killer. Her husband said she was cautious and would not have opened the door to just anyone. There was little evidence of a struggle, and Lindy had neatly put everything on the kitchen table and put her purse away. It looked more like she'd been involved in putting away the groceries and someone she felt comfortable with was in the apartment with her, or someone knocked on the door and she let them in. I did learn that Lindy's door had a peephole. And remember that arterial blood spray was on the door. All signs point to Lindy being interrupted while putting away the groceries and going to the door. Perhaps she looked through the peephole, saw someone she knew, opened it, and was stabbed for the first time right then and there. Other than theories, the police had nothing, despite working around the clock, as Lieutenant West put it. District Attorney D. Richard Ekman met with the Pennsylvania State Police and the Manor Township PD and requested a stepped-up effort with more personnel assigned to the case. Lancaster City Police and neighboring township investigators were also assisting. Under pressure from the media, on December 16th, police admitted they were not close to an arrest. A month later, on January 11th, 1976, the police refused to comment at all. Police quickly were forced to expand the scope of the investigation to people who didn't know Lindy. They looked for any knife-related crimes for which area ex-felons had been convicted. They checked prison furlough records, because some prisoners can be released on weekends, which I didn't realize is still a thing. And one potential suspect soon emerged. In January 1976, 18-year-old Mark D. Capilupo was arrested after following a woman to her Eden Manor home. When she ran inside and locked the door, he stood on her doorstep, ringing the bell over and over. Alert to a potential attack because of Lindy's case, the woman called the police and they arrested Capilupo. It turned out that he had raped 4 teens and women in vicious attacks in the area starting on December 2nd in East Lancaster and extending into January, and police had withheld this information from the public. Capilupo also had a hideous record as a sexual predator, starting from when he raped a young stay-at-home mom in her apartment when he was only 15. A la Ted Bundy, he pretended to have been hit by a car, so a young woman gave him a ride, and he assaulted her. In 1973, he faced 5 counts of indecent assault, multiple escape from juvenile custody attempts, and theft. He had been sent to the juvie wing of an adult prison in October 1973 and was released in April 1975. He allegedly killed a man in Arizona before committing the attacks on females in the Lancaster area in late December 1975 and early 1976. Not until police had Capilupo in custody on all the rapes did they inform the public of the predator who had been in their midst. The police hadn't wanted to publicize the attacks on women in case the suspect was Lindy's killer. They didn't want to spook him into fleeing the jurisdiction. The judgment call was met with anger from the citizenry in the area who felt they should have been alerted to the rapist so they could take precautions. Anyway, police looked at Capilupo in Lindy's case, as he was active at the time she was killed and she resembled his victims, young, white women, some of whom were attacked in their own apartments. Police thought perhaps Lindy had fought back against Capiloubo's attack and he had killed her in a frenzied rage. But Capiloubo had an alibi in that he was at work at his job as a cook at an area Hardee's on the evening of December 5th, and he was present for his entire shift of 5 p.m. to 1:30 a.m. The police were satisfied with this alibi, although I don't know whether they actually confirmed it through interviews of coworkers and managers on duty that night. Mark Capiloubo denied any involvement in Lindy's case, and he died in July 1976, shot by prison guards in an attempted escape. Another thing police did, despite Lieutenant West maintaining that the killer was probably a local and Lindy was targeted, was send teletypes about the murder to other jurisdictions and follow up on stabbing murders with similar circumstances. One of these was a murder of a young woman in Anne Arundel County, Maryland, just across the Maryland border. This young woman also had been seen shopping at a store before she was killed in her own apartment in a knife attack. But the woman in Maryland had been sexually assaulted, and police at this time had no reason to believe that Lindy had been. The autopsy found no physical evidence of that on her body. Police continued their investigation. Behind the scenes, they were working hard at drumming up leads and pursuing investigative avenues. They provided weekly reports to the DA's office, which was on top of the case because of public pressure to solve it. By early February, they said they had questioned more than 250 people and consulted experienced forensic pathologists, Dr. Halbert Fillinger in Philadelphia and Dr. Russell Fisher in Baltimore. Lieutenant West told the media that they believed the suspect was still in the Lancaster area, and also that he was unlikely to have committed any similar crimes. This was because police firmly believed that the killer was someone who knew Lindy, someone who was fixated on her, and that she was the specific target. It was not a random crime committed by an itinerant murderer. Someone had been allowed into Lindy's apartment, and something had happened. He lost control, and he killed Lindy. Those circumstances made it unlikely that he had done that before. Then these theories were temporarily called into question when 43-year-old Mary Shinzing was stabbed to death in her Columbia apartment on March 5, 1976. The similarities to Lindy's case were undeniable. Mary was slain while at home alone on a Friday night, the 5th day of the month, between 5:30 and 7:30 p.m., and was stabbed multiple times. Like Lindy, she lived in a ground-floor, one-bedroom apartment in a small building within a larger complex, and there was no forced entry. As in Lindy's case, she was discovered by a relative who stopped by the apartment after cashing her paycheck for Mary, who had multiple sclerosis. Investigators on Lindy's case immediately took note and considered whether the cases could be related. But unlike in Lindy's case, in Mary's, there was a quick arrest. On March 16th, just 11 days after Mary was killed, Kenneth Dale Arndt was arrested. The 33-year-old was a maintenance worker for Mary's apartment complex and had done work in her unit. He also had a record of burglary, receiving stolen property, and larceny. Arndt was a local and attended Edward Hand Junior High in Lancaster in the mid-1950s, where Lindy had also been a student years later. Not only that, Arndt had worked on the delivery trucks for Nicholas Company Appliances on Locust Street, and there was some indication he may have worked a truck that delivered to the Spring Manor apartments right before Lindy was killed. Police were intrigued at these connections to Lindy's case, but after Arndt was questioned, Lancaster District Attorney D. Richard Ekman said they had no indication that he was responsible for her murder. According to the Intelligencer Journal, Ekman said the rumor about Arndt being at the Spring Manor complex, quote, is unfounded. He said the authorities checked all delivery slips from the company and found that some time ago, the firm made a delivery to the general area of the complex, end quote. But it wasn't certain Arndt was on the truck, and the delivery was nearly a year earlier. Let's talk about a suspect who police focused on for a long time. This was someone who knew Lindy well, someone who was part of her daily life. I'm talking about her boss, Bob Almond. Police noted the closeness between the two. Lindy baked for him. She wrote him little notes on occasion. He referred to her as a marvelous person who made an outsized impression on him. Police wondered whether Bob, who was 34 and single, might have been interested in Lindy. Perhaps he'd showed up at her home, likely aware, because of their friendship, that Philip was not at home in the evenings. and knocked on the door, she certainly would have let him in. Perhaps once in the apartment, he came on to her, she rejected him, and he went into a murderous rage. Bob didn't really have an alibi, and police went after him pretty hard. It's clear that at least some of the investigators believed that he was likely the culprit. Bob took a lie detector test, but when the investigators continued to harass him, he obtained a lawyer, someone who could help protect his privacy, he said. Of course, that doesn't help police see one as innocent, and it didn't. Bob lamented that he was crushed that police considered him a suspect just because he was close with Lindy. And Bob's potential role in the slaying gave rise to a whole slew of tangential suspects. This is all a little confusing, so bear with me. It turned out that within weeks after the murder, Bob had committed himself to a psychiatric ward at a local hospital. Right as his name was appearing in the papers as the owner of the flower shop where Lindy worked, Bob went to his friend Robert B., head of paramedics at St. Joseph's Hospital, and Robert helped him commit himself to the psych ward. He was then transferred to the psych ward at Wernersville Hospital. A paramedic named Lester C. at St. Joseph's called the Millersville police and reported to them that a man who had been named in the papers as a potential suspect had just committed himself to the psych ward without going through the usual intake processes. Something seemed fishy, and he felt this was something they should know. He later learned that the hospital refused to permit the police to interview Bob while he was in their care. Table Bob for the moment. Police came back to him, and so will we. The first anniversary of Lindy's murder rolled around on December 5th, 1976. There had been no arrests. Philip had moved out of the Spring Manor apartments and into a Millersville apartment with his sister Beth. He granted an anniversary interview to the Intelligencer Journal, in which he said he'd played this scenario of Lindy's killing over and over in his mind, and he really believed that the man who stabbed her 19 times had to be someone they knew. For Philip, the fact that Lindy was putting away groceries and then was attacked meant she had likely opened the door to someone. That person had to be in the apartment to have access to the knife he had taken from their kitchen. DA D. Richard Ekman voiced his frustration at the lack of progress. He told the Intelligencer Journal that, "It's stonewalled. There just haven't been any new leads. We hope, we try. We still hope we can catch someone, but it's going to require someone who knows something to finally come forward." 3 weeks before the first anniversary on November 16, 1976, Lindy's family had installed a tombstone on her grave behind Boehm's United Methodist Church in Pequea Township. It had her name, dates, the engraved word wife, and the inscription "Gone but not forgotten." A month later, the family visited the grave on December 26th and was horrified to see someone had vandalized the grave marker. The vandal had nicked and chipped it with a metal tool like a screwdriver to chip and nick the new gravestone in multiple places, and had splashed symbolic blood-red paint all over it. No other gravestones in the church cemetery were damaged. Sergeant James Wenner of the Pennsylvania State Police said, "What would be the motive? I don't understand it." It's hard to imagine how the family felt seeing that, reliving the trauma of someone stabbing Lindy to death all over again. Assumptions were made that the killer had done this, taken one final stab at Lindy out of some kind of vendetta. No one has ever been named as the vandal of Lindy's headstone, but many believe that the vandal was her killer, continuing to taunt her and her family. On January 5th, 1977, a year and a month to the day after Lindy's murder, Chief Sheeler of the Manor Township Police received a letter about Lindy's case. Believing it to be a hoax, he did not release the existence of the letter or its contents for decades to come. Lindy's case load reduced to tips called in and tangential leads that cropped up. In 1981, famed FBI profiler John Douglas of the agency's Investigative Support Unit did a profile in the Lindy Biechler case. This profile has never been released in full, but we know that Douglas concluded the killer was a male between the ages of 19 and 25, and the crime scene reflected a great deal of rage and anger. Douglas, too, believed that the killer was likely someone who knew Lindy or believed that he did. It's unclear how much value police put on Douglas's profile because, also in 1981, the Lancaster District Attorney's Office paid $2,500 to the Mobius Society, a group of psychics based in California to consider Lindy's case. One male and one female psychic looked at Lindy's photo and offered up their visions. I saw video footage of the male psychic rubbing a photo of Lindy and saying he saw a bloody stabbing in a narrow room. The assailant had a tattoo on his arm and had dark or olive skin and darker brown hair and eyes and a mustache. He was thin, had long eyelashes, and possibly was of Italian ancestry. A female psychic said she also saw a dark-haired, olive-skinned man. County Detective Paul Wagner told the Lancaster New Era that the psychics may have been describing Mark Capilupo, who you'll recall was a suspect because he had sexually assaulted some women in the area around the time of Lindy's murder. Capilupo fit the psychic's description with tattoos on both arms, but he had an alibi and police had ruled him out. Spoiler alert, it wasn't him. During this time period in the 1980s, a lot happened behind the scenes on the Biechler case, but we don't have details because the investigative records have never been released. In October 1982, the serial killer Gerald Eugene Stano came to the attention of police. Stano had been arrested in April of that year for murdering dozens of women, including 4 to 6 in Pennsylvania, where he had worked at a Philadelphia hospital. Stano's parents lived in the East Hempfield Township in Lancaster County from July 1975 to August 1976, during the time period in which Lindy had been killed. And when Stano was arrested, he had a Pennsylvania driver's license with the East Hempfield address on it. Lindy's stabbing death fit the M.O. Stano had employed in his murders, but his known victims were generally sex workers or hitchhikers. Still, police thought he might have been in Lancaster visiting or staying with his parents, and it was possible that he could have seen Lindy leaving the grocery store and followed her. Police circulated photos of Stano at John Herr's Market and Lindy's bank, but didn't find anyone who recognized him, according to a report in the New Era. They eventually decided to move on from Stano, as he had confessed to his other victims, but had not named Lindy as one of them, and in fact denied ever being in Lancaster County, which was questionable as he had a driver's license issued to an address there. Lieutenant Harvey West told the Lancaster New Era in January 1983, quote, "At this point, we cannot show he was in this area at all. The chances of him being here are slim," end quote. The district attorney investigator Mark Wagner told the media they had talked to serial murder confessors in Florida and Texas. These were Gerald Stano and Henry Lee Lucas, I believe. Let's move on from that guy. Over the years, Lindy's case was moved around from lead agency to lead agency. It was initially worked by Manor Township Police, and then it was moved to the state police. In June 1992, a new investigator took over the case, Joe Giese, captain of detectives of the Lancaster City Police, which had had only a very tangential role in Lindy's case, retired from that agency and joined the district attorney's office as lead county detective in the DA's Major Crimes Homicide Unit. Giese's assignment was to work unsolved murders in the jurisdiction, starting with Lindy's, which was a thorn in everyone's side. The original detective on the case, Lieutenant Harvey West, had died in 1991, taking with him his innate knowledge of the investigation, but leaving behind his notes, which Giese reviewed in detail. Giese really worked this case. He went back to the beginning and tried to recontact every person in the case file. For example, he revisited the Bob Almond angle. Bob was dead, but Giese learned from Ann Newcomer, a nurse at St. Joseph's Hospital, that Bob had been admitted to the psych ward more than once. Ann had become interested in the case because of her connection to the hospital and a number of suspects there, which I will get into in a moment. Ann provided Detective Giese, whom she knew personally, with a number of documents from the hospital. And in a startling coincidence, Ann and Mike Little discovered that they were biological half-siblings. Mike had been adopted by Lindy's father and his wife Thelma, but his real father had been a local businessman with a whole other family, including his daughter Ann. Back to the hospital suspects I just mentioned. A volunteer with the West End Ambulance Association named Katie T. had been seriously assaulted by men she could not identify in her home on Marion Street. She was beaten and kicked and ended up in the hospital in intensive care. Rumors flew that the attack was perpetrated by another hospital employee Katie was in a relationship with, emergency room nurse Gerald H. This was within a few months after Lindy's murder. I don't know exactly how Gerald became a suspect in Lindy's case, but somehow he knew Lindy through Bob Ament and Robert B., his close friends. He was known to frequent the flower shop where Lindy worked, and Gerald had lived at the Spring Manor apartments where Lindy lived. Gerald had inexplicably left town and vanished for 2 months right after Lindy's slaying. He was known to have a temper and, quote, fly off the handle, which is an old-timey expression for being prone to fits of rage. And Katie had told others that she felt she was being watched or followed, very similar to Lindy. There was some inquiry into whether Gerald was the author of the mysterious letter police had received from someone purporting to be the killer. Apparently his handwriting was similar. Joe Giese looked into this entire convoluted mess, interviewing former hospital employees at length and methodically checking off all the people entangled in the hospital angle. Apparently he felt that Bob A. was not a suspect, but Gerald H. remained on the list. But like everyone else who looked into the case, Giese was powerless to bring it to resolution. In 1997, there was a big break in the case. On February 24, 1997, Detective Giese sent some of the evidence in Lindy's case, her clothing, to Cellmark Labs in Maryland. Cellmark examined the clothing, much of which was covered in dried 2-decade-old blood, and found something else. If you recall, Lindy was found with her jeans unzipped and unbuttoned, exposing her pantyhose. Well, on the right side of the underwear she was wearing under the hose, Cellmark analysts detected a spot of semen. On June 6, 1997, Cellmark reported that a male DNA profile was obtained from the semen stain. I'm not sure why it took this long, but on February 3, 2000, the DNA profile was entered into CODIS. There were no hits, and over the next 20 years, investigators never received a single notification of any match in the CODIS database. But now they had confirmation that Lindy's killer had sexually assaulted her, giving a motive to a crime that until that point had seemed senseless, pointless, and random. And Lindy's pantyhose were found to have 2 tiny blood droplets on them that were suspected to have come from the killer. This meant that the semen had likely been deposited on the underwear after the stabbing had occurred. In 1989, with the very early advent of DNA testing, testing was attempted on the 2 blood droplets on the pantyhose, but the small degraded samples didn't yield a workable DNA profile with the 1989 testing technology. Detective Giese entered Lindy's case into VICAP in case her killer had struck elsewhere and his handiwork was in other jurisdictions and could be linked to him. But of course, stabbing murders of women with sexual assault or attempted sexual assault are numerous. They're basically why this podcast exists. VICAP brought in some leads but didn't solve the case. Their only hope was that now that the investigators had a DNA profile, they could use it to eliminate potential suspects. And they did. The semen did not come from Philip Biechler. According to the Lancaster DA's office, over the years, dozens of people were cleared by alibi and blood type, and then DNA ruled out more than 10 more. People whose names were in the case file were tracked down and requested for DNA samples. Time and again, comparison tests were conducted, and time and again, results were negative. The 25th anniversary of Lindy's murder rolled around. The DA in 2000, Donald Tartaro, formed a task force to reinvestigate the case, comprising multiple detectives, including Michael Landis, Peter Savage, and Joe Giese, as well as members of the FBI's BAU. 8 FBI agents under Supervisory Special Agent James Fitzgerald spent a day considering the case and brainstorming ideas. Per LNP Lancaster, quote, the FBI agents pored over crime scene photographs, autopsy reports, witness interviews, background on Lindy, maps, Lancaster County demographics, and other information to form an analysis of the case, end quote. In August 2001, the District Attorney Tartaro also convened the second ever Lancaster investigative grand jury to consider several unsolved cases. Lindy's family got their hopes up that an indictment was imminent, but it has never been verified that Lindy's case was even one of the cases the grand jury took up, and nothing came of it. But one thing the 2000 investigators did was release some new information. They told the public some things they considered fact. Lindy believed someone was watching her. She was killed by a man she likely knew. There was evidence of a fierce struggle between Lindy and her killer, who attempted to sexually assault her and stabbed her 19 times in rage and frustration. But there was more. Police believe the killer may have contacted them. On January 5, 1977, a year and a month after Lindy's murder, a letter addressed to Manor Township Police Chief Donald Sheeler arrived at the police station. The envelope was marked urgent in handwriting. Inside was a 2-page handwritten letter. The 2,000 investigators revealed that at the time, the contemporary detectives had considered the letter a likely hoax. They were focused on people who knew Lindy and didn't sound at all like the man who wrote the missive. Many people believe that the failure to release this letter was a horrible error in judgment. Had they published the letter as the writer requested, the handwriting may have been recognized by a local resident familiar with the writer. Further, engaging with the letter writer may have led to further communication, in other words, follow-up letters, and may have led to more clues. Not only that, the original letter had long ago been lost by the crime lab. All they had to go on was copies, so the use of DNA, prints, paper analysis, and so on was out of the question. Much later, Detective Giese would tell L&P Lancaster that the investigators screwed up the Biechler investigation from the beginning, and the loss of the letter was a good example of that. Anyway, now in 2000, with the revamped cold case unit reinvestigating the case, they put a little more stock in the letter and decided to release it. The letter is written in the voice of the killer, with a postscript from a woman named Janice Crum, who professes to know him. Here is the text. Hi, Sheeler. Just eats your heart up knowing you haven't caught me yet. Still around. Lindy's marker on her grave just turned me on like she did, and the way she looked all bloody, like the paint on her marker. The scratch and nick marks represent the knife stabs. Count them. You wondered if the guy at the gas station in Mountville were related to Biechler's murder. Forget it. No way, man. I'll tell you what, Chief Pig. You print this letter in the paper, along with a picture in Friday night's Lancaster paper and Saturday morning's paper, and I might confess, when I get off my trip. You see, the world owes me a living. Maybe I give you a few hints who I am. Got busted once for drugs a few years back. Live in West End of Lancaster suburbs. I am 5'10" tall, 205 pounds, fat and beautiful, and capable of killing again without knowing it. December 5th, 1975, was under the stupor of amphetamines, like right now. Well-educated man in the community, single, good job, but God, please, Chief, help me, I am losing my mind. Help me before I kill again. The headaches kill me. Every time it aches, the drugs only calm it, temporarily. Will God forgive me? Please print this, Chief, in the paper so I know you got it. Then I write you again, God, I need a priest, what have I done? Help me, please. P.S. Chief Sheeler, my friend has confessed to the killing of Lindy Sue Biechler as God is my witness. Do as he asks. Print this letter on the front page. I am not aware of his intentions right now, but contemplating murder is not his intentions. He is mentally sick. When the letter appears, he will turn himself in. He described the relationship he and Lindy had before he killed her. He only realizes it now. When you're on drugs, you're not responsible for your actions. Please, he is asleep now. That's why I finished the letter. All I can tell you, my friend frequents Manor Shopping Center in the evenings and the fields around it, mostly weeknights. He will contact you very soon, and when he does, please bring a Catholic priest to the police station. Signed, Janice Crum. In 2006, FBI profiler James Fitzgerald assessed the case and concluded that the killer was someone who knew Lindy. This person was someone with an explosive temper. Fitzgerald told L&P Lancaster, quote, "The crime scene reflected a great deal of rage and anger. This offender was extremely angry and frustrated at the time of the homicide," end quote. Fitzgerald also believed the killer was inexperienced based on the sloppy and disorganized nature of the crime scene. The theory was that the killer had tried to use his smaller 4-inch knife on Lindy, but she fought back, she moved around, lamps were knocked over, his knife might have gotten broken or he cut himself, and so he grabbed the butcher knife and towel from the kitchen and resumed stabbing. He was so focused on Lindy and the task at hand that he wasn't worried about being caught. Lindy could easily have screamed for help, and there was no way that he could have known that no one else was at home in the apartment building. Fitzgerald said the murder was overkill. Lindy was stabbed 19 times. He noted that overkill generally is an indication that the killer knows the victim. Out-of-control emotions usually aren't aroused by complete strangers. The killer may have had a more casual, innocent relationship with Lindy that he believed to have been more significant. She may have rejected him or did something else that offended him. Fitzgerald said, quote, "She played some role in this guy's life. When you have multiple stab wounds, there is a lot of interpersonal aggression coming forth," end quote. Lindy was likely the subject of stalking by this man, and finally, things came to a head in her apartment. Fitzgerald concluded that the attack on Lindy was likely her killer's first murder, but not his first attack of rage. The killer probably had a history of yelling, lashing out, punching, or slapping people around him. He possibly had a low-level criminal history. After the murder, he likely took one of two very different paths. Either he went off the deep end, using drugs and alcohol, and being on the fringes of society, or he became extremely religious and or very dutiful at work and attentive at home. Fitzgerald also evaluated the letter and the vandalism of Lindy's gravestone. He noted that the vandalism would jibe with the type of personality the profilers had ascribed to Lindy's killer. He would not rule out that the vandal and the killer were one and the same. He said, quote, "Perhaps it is a substitute act of violence against a victim who could no longer be personally reached," end quote. As for the letter, Fitzgerald believed that the letter and the Janice Crum postscript were written by the same person, and that person was a woman or a man struggling with his sexual identity. He did not believe the letter writer was the killer, and the investigators did not see any connection between Lindy's case and the other murder mentioned in the letter. The number of nicks and chips on the tombstone and the number of stab wounds was not far off, Fitzgerald noted. Police did try to track down Janice Crum. It's unclear whether they found anyone of that name, although we know that a woman with that name was indeed living in the area at the time. All they would say is that they never located anyone with that name who had any connection to the crime. In honor of the 25th anniversary of Lindy's slaying and to revive public interest in her unsolved murder, the Lancaster New Era did a multi-part expose on the unsolved case, interviewing Lindy's family. They talked to Philip Biechler. Quote, "I would like to see some closure," he said. "I want to finally get the answer to why. The why part of it is probably what would help the most," end quote. Eileen Martin, Lindy's sister, said, quote, "It's hard to say how a murder affects a family. If someone passes away naturally, you can look at them as having a good life. But her being stolen, that's the way I look at what happened. It was really difficult to deal with." Lindy's mother, Eleanor, said she prayed daily for the case to be solved. "This time of year is very hard for me. It's certainly something that you never get over, ever. I don't want to die until I find out who killed her and why. She's been gone so long, and it's like sometimes she's been forgotten, and that hurts so bad. She didn't live long enough to do anything." Sadly, Little's father, Wayne Little, did not live long enough to see that happen. Little, who was divorced from Mrs. Gazy when Lindy was small, died this summer at the Essa Florey Hospital Center as investigators were poring over his daughter's case. I think probably to his last day, he had the faith that it would be solved somehow, some way, says his son Michael, Lindy's younger stepbrother, who lives in San Diego. Little, 31, who was 6 when Lindy was killed, says, with him passing away, people throughout the family would say, now he's with Lindy. Now he knows. Let's talk about Mike Little, Lindy's stepbrother, who had been just a little kid when Lindy died. He knew her as the adult older sister who babysat him and who was a lot of fun. As an adult, Mike made his mission to keep the heat under the police. He was in regular contact via email with Detective Peter Savage, the Lancaster County detective who was working the case. Savage had been a patrolman at the original crime scene, worked the case as a detective sergeant in the Manor Township Police, and then joined the DA's office investigative team and continued to work the case there. Mike stayed on Savage, requesting information, updates, and accountability. In a 2005 email exchange with County Detective Peter Savage, Savage promises that he will remain in regular touch with the family, Mike, Eleanor, and Philip Biechler. Without giving details, he tells Mike that there are at least 2 people who have refused to give a blood sample for DNA testing against the evidence in the case. Neither of these men is a prime suspect, but both have come up in the course of the investigation. Both names have come up as possible suspects, but there is nothing ironclad in that area. Our reason for wanting their blood is just to eliminate them as we have eliminated over 20 people. That all from Detective Savage. This was his assurance that the case was not being ignored. Savage made clear that Detective Giese and he continued to pursue the case, and he says, in fact, Giese is the one who was responsible for the renewed reinvestigation in 2000. Mike decided to push harder. He was frustrated with the lack of progress in the case, and the lack of information sharing on the part of the investigators gave the appearance of nothing happening. The family's relationship with the DA's office was tense. Then Mike connected the DA's office with the Philadelphia-based VDOC Society, which agreed to consider the case. Mike pushed the VDOC review, partially so fresh expert eyes would provide insight, but also because it would be a means of accessing some actual case information, as it was not being shared with him. While the investigators were willing to provide him with generic updates and assurances, they would not release actual case file information even to Lindy's family. The VDOC Society, named for the 18th century French detective Eugène François Vidocq, is a group of 80 to 100 crime-solving experts who meet monthly to review unsolved cases. In June 2006, detectives Joe Giese and Peter Savage went before the VDOC team of experts, who purportedly had a combined 1,000 years of crime-solving expertise. After hearing the details of the case, the evidence, the theories, and potential suspects, they deemed the case solvable, but would not tell the public why. County Detective Mike Landis said only that they did not believe Lindy's murder was random. With the review, Lindy's mother, Eleanor Giese, told LNP Lancaster, quote, "I have prayed every single night for 30 years that there will be justice for her death. My God, maybe it will come. Knowing that people are still working on it after all these years is very important to me," end quote. Mike Little, largely responsible for bringing about the VDOC review, told the publication, quote, "At this point, we knew, considering evidence at the crime scene, that Lindy fought for her life. The right thing for our family to do is to continue to fight for the resolution of this case. There's no doubt in my mind, with the DA's office and now with the VDOC Society involved, this makes the team more robust and capable to solve this murder. The bottom line is that this family will not rest until there's an arrest. In my heart of hearts, I feel this guy is still alive and still in Lancaster. We want to get him." It was kind of a letdown when nothing came of the VDOC review. In the fall of 2007, frustrated with the lack of shared information and tired of the platitudes that the case was being worked, Mike Little emailed the district attorney, Craig Stedman, asking for information on the status of the investigation. The DA emailed him back saying that 2 of the best investigators in the county were on the case and they simply could not share any information because it might compromise the investigation. Stedman assured Mike that his investigators would continue to do all they could to see that justice was done. So Mike took a different approach. He reached out to the family of Christy Morak. Those of you who listened to Season 1 of DNA ID are familiar with this well-known case. In a nutshell, Christy was a 25-year-old beloved teacher who was raped and killed in her Lancaster apartment in December 1992 by an unnamed assailant who was believed to have been watching her. Like Lindy's, Christy's case was unsolved, and her family, too, was frustrated with the lack of transparency being provided by the authorities in Lancaster. The relationships of both families to the DA's office were strained at best. In an email from Mike to Christy Morak's brother Vince in October 2007, Mike wrote about the details of Lindy's murder and the similarities in the cases. Quote, "Although separated by 17 years, after reading about Christy, I could not help but wonder if they were somehow connected," end quote. Mike laid out the basic facts of Lindy's case for Vince. Quote, "Over the past 32 years, the case has seen its up and downs. It's been moved from the township to the state and now to the county where it remains cold, though active, with the DA's Major Crimes Homicide Unit. When my dad died, I felt it my obligation to carry on the fight to keep the pressure on the DA to solve this case. With Dad gone, Lindy's mom gone, and now the DA leaving office in January, I feel there is a certain urgency," end quote. Mike told Vince there had been some friction between his family and the DA's office, and he knew from reading the newspapers that the Morak family had the same feeling of helplessness. He concluded with, quote, "I struggle with the fact that 32 years ago, in a small Lancaster County township where everyone knows everybody, someone who knew Lindy, someone Lindy knew, walked into her apartment, tried to sexually assault her, and literally slaughtered her, left behind significant DNA, and just vanished." This is the end of part 1 of the Lindy Sue Biechler case. Part 2 is available right now.